Okay, so today I just wanted to talk a little bit about modernism, and that's sort of a big deal in this era. And modernism is usually defined as around 1900 to around 1945 is roughly, again, there's not like everybody woke up in the first day of 1900 and said, we're modernists now, but rather the sort of slow evolution over time from one style to the next. Remember that modernism was preceded by realism, and realism was very much of the notion that we'll depict things as they are, how they function, and so on. But there are still strains of the very floral language that we had in Romanticism, but much more stripped down. Modernism is going to amp that up even more, and I'm just going to kind of go to the modernist manifestos, and you can see on Ezra Pound on page 811, says that, and he says it several times, but essentially he's got rules for writing, and one of the first ones that he mentions in terms of the language is use no superfluous word, no adjective which does not reveal something. And Ezra Pound is sort of one of the central hubs of modernist thought in America, and he'll have some issues a little bit later on. He'll get tried for treason and all these other sorts of things, be confined to a mental asylum. But he will be very violent in the way that he feels that poetry and fiction should be written just very basic. You'll see people like Hemingway, for instance, really pick up on this, and he will have so few adjectives in many ways that the meaning itself sort of becomes obscured. And so you see that stylistically occurring in modernism. And here too, you'll see, if I go to the Mina Loy and hold it up here, it's not backwards, but you can see stylistically too, you'll see sort of a resistance to the notion of what was once known as being conventional. And so by conventional, I mean like just the way things have been done in the past. You'll see in many cases that a lot of our writers will work hard to purposefully avoid anything that would be known as a specific style. And this would include things in poetry in particular. You'll see that there's no blank verse or free verse or sonnet form or anything of that nature. No formula really that people follow. They may adopt one just to see if they can do it or something like that. But for the most part, they'll abandon that, and they will work hard to try to come up with new ways of expressing themselves. You'll see this in the art world too. You'll see like surrealism come up. So if you've seen Salvador Dali and so on, you can see this happening. It's not just literature, but across the board. You can see it in film. Over time, things go from sort of realistic to more dark and gritty experimental styles and camera work and music and so on. But as far as literature goes, we see sort of a purposeful vacation, in other words, an abandoning of what we would say would be conventional style. Another thing too is we move away from the thematics, sort of the circumstances behind modernism. And again, this is around 1900-ish. It'll fully be in effect, I think, around the end of World War I. It's pretty easy to forget how traumatizing World War I was to pretty much everybody associated with it. But World War I sort of upset the order of things tremendously. Before, we had kings still we had empires. The Ottoman Empire was still around. Austria, Hungary, Austro-Hungary or whatever. It was all like massive countries that were put together and ruled by kings. And then World War I, and then ends after all the brutality of trench warfare and gas warfare and so on and so forth. We will see that reorder the entire configuration of the world. America will suddenly become a superpower. They get tons of money. Germany will be significantly weakened, and that will lead to issues, of course, as we go to World War II. England's naval power will fade dramatically, so we'll see a lot of the old colonial powers start to be disrupted by the presence of the United States. So England and Spain, the Netherlands will all sort of start losing their colonies left and right, especially after World War II, but it'll start earlier. And then, of course, there's the brutality of World War I. You have poison gas being dropped on people, and you can go and you can read accounts. In one case, the Germans unleashed in one of their first experiments chlorine gas towards the British lines. And British soldiers were able to write later that they could see the gas approaching them because it was killing every leaf on the tree as it went by. So you can actually see like a green leaf sort of curl up and turn brown as it approached them. And that's pretty nasty stuff if you think about it. It's pretty horrifying. And so you'll see like some books have even, this one, for instance, is fairly new. but it talks about how World War One sort of influenced the horror genre, and you don't really see what we would say would be conventional horror until after World War One. I mean, you have people like Poe sort of kicking around, but he's not writing what we would conceive as horror, and so we start to see a lot of people note that World War One was a horrible breaking of society, and so as a result, you have a loss of convention. So Friedrich Nietzsche, right, who writes "Thus Spake Zarathustra," a philosopher, he'll later go mad as well, and so in that one, he has a guy who yells out, "God is dead, don't you understand?" basically, and so that's sort of what happens in modernism. They take a look at stuff that's going on, World War One, industrialization, modernization of everything, and they'll say, this whole religion thing isn't working out anymore. We need to come up with something else that would be some way for the human spirit to thrive. And so art becomes one thing. There's lots of experimentation with that, lots of experimentation with literature, and so on. So if you take a look specifically at the Modernist manifestos, you can see that stripping down language was the key. I mean, Willa Cather rather, on 812 will say in the very first line, the novel for a long while has been over furnished. So again, sort of breaking it down as far as they possibly can, and just sort of trying to come up with something new to match the sort of new world that we're in. One last thing to mention too, a lot of the writers that we have during this time period will be known as the Lost Generation. Gertrude Stein, who's sort of a major female artist and poet and writer during the time period. She's going to be an expatriate in Paris for much of her life. Hemingway will spend time with her. William Carlos Williams, tons of people will go and hang out with her. She will refer to them as the Lost Generation. So not only the people who were killed in World War One, but those whose worldview was completely warped by World War One. Everything that was ordered is now unordered, and you'll start to see, like T.S. Eliot, for instance, will talk about the real and the unreal, like what is real and then what is not real, right, but still exist. And there's more about that, of course, with The Wasteland, and you'll notice the title of this book. Right. So anyway, all of these notions of things sort of falling apart, destruction overall, and sort of the almost an apocalyptic feeling. And so that's a lot of modernism in a nutshell. And as you read these stories, you'll see that you'll see tons of experimentation, there's no doubt about that. But also there's sort of a decaying sense of what was. And we can even go into gender studies and, for instance, masculinity. What is masculine changes dramatically from our realist era to our modernist era. And if you think about the 20s and feminism as well, if you think about the 1920s, we had lots of gender bending. Guys were starting to be more dandy in their dress and their manner, and women were flappers, if you heard that term before. And they were wearing slacks and starting to agitate for voting rights, all of these sorts of things too. So what was our standard definition of being a man or a woman also comes under assault and becomes way more fluid in the modern era. Just like everything else, the whole world itself feels like it's breaking apart, and there's a lot of wasteland out there, okay? And as a result, what do we do? What are we going to make out of this, if anything? And can we survive this? And then, of course, World War II will come along, and everyone's notions of what true apocalyptic, ideas and reordering of the world were will then become much bigger. So well beyond the conception of what even our modernists were able to conceive. So that's modernism pretty much in a nutshell. If you read the Modernist manifestos, I just highlighted a couple things here and there, but they're really a good way to understand sort of the experimentation of form, but also sort of the philosophy that's at work. Again, sort of the end of the natural order of things as they knew it, sort of a replacing or recreation of things, and sort of questioning convention, attacking convention, trying to think of ways to create something anew from pretty much nothing. And so we'll see sort of I want to say reinvigoration, but sort of a resetting or reconfiguring of America as a notion, as an ideal of culture, of religion, of art. All of that's going to change over time during this modernist era.